So in any event, last week, we ended last week, just after the Reformation in Germany and Switzerland. Three groups of Christians dominated Western Europe: Roman Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists. Which religion was practiced in particular areas dependent on the rulers in that area. People were expected to practice the beliefs of the rulers, and if they didn't want to believe that, they would have to leave. So today we will look at the 300 years after the Reformation. We'll begin in England, which produced the writings that ultimately produced the idea of religious freedom in the United States. We'll then go to the colonies and see what happened there. We'll actually see a lack of religious freedom in the colonies. And we'll end with the enactment of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and the adoption of similar provisions in the states, which then will be the background for all of this. That's what it is. Henry VIII became King of England in 1509, about the same time as the Reformation. But was a man of impressive intellectual abilities and executive force, well-read and always interested in scholastic theology, sympathetic with humanism, popular with the mass of people, egotistic, obstinate, and given to fitful acts of terror.
This is one person?
He could have written that himself, right? Yeah.
Henry VIII began his reign as a devout Roman Catholic. When Luther's writings were first introduced into England during his reign, their use was forbidden by law. Thomas More, who I'm sure you've heard of, and Henry's chancellor, launched a campaign against the early English followers of Luther, leading to many being burned at the stake. For his bloody rejection of the teachings of Luther, the Pope gave Henry VIII the title Defender of the Faith, a title that is still used by English kings and queens. By the 1530s, though, anti-papal sympathies in England were running high, and perhaps equally important, Henry VIII needed a divorce. The Pope would not grant. And so the need for a divorce and the tradition of reform begun by Wycliffe in the 14th century caused Henry in 1534 to reject the Pope, declare himself the supreme head of the church. This painting, which was actually owned by Henry VIII, shows the stoning of the Pope. But Henry did not reject the teachings of the Catholic Church. He simply considered himself an Orthodox Catholic, save in regard to the Pope. He rejected marriage by priests and giving wine to participants in communion. As we saw last week in connection with the Reformation in Germany and Switzerland, rejecting the Pope's authority simply transferred the control of beliefs and punishments to secular authorities.
Was there ever actually a stoning of a pope, or is this just a fever dream?
That's just his picture. It's just an imagination. Henry VIII ordered that denial of the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation was quote to be punished by fire. During his reign, 60 people were burned at the stake as heresies. Next slide. On Henry's death, his frail 10-year-old son became King Edward VI. Guided by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, official English policy shifted abruptly in the Protestant direction. Laws passed by Henry VIII requiring adherence to Catholic beliefs were repealed. Priests were allowed to marry, and worship was conducted according to the Book of Common Prayer, which was written by Thomas Cranmer. Edward VI died after 6 years as king, and was replaced by his half-sister Mary. Mary, described as probably the only really pious English monarch of the 16th century, restored Catholicism as the official religion of England. She condemned nearly 300 Protestants to be burned at the stake, earning herself the title Bloody Mary. Thomas Cranmer, who's in the middle here, author of the Book of Common Prayer, was himself burned. During his trial for heresy, under duress, he had signed a document repudiating his reformed views and accepting authority of the Pope. But interestingly, he was convicted anyway. And he went to his death announcing the Pope as Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all his false doctrine. And he stuck his hand in the fire, the hand that had been used to sign that false declaration. Let's go to the next slide. Mary died in 1558. Elizabeth, another daughter of Henry VIII, replaced her. So we have the Protestant, the Catholic, and then we have Elizabeth. She wanted to come up with something in the middle, so she described herself as the middle way. Like the followers of Calvin, she accepted only the Bible as authority and recognized only two sacraments, the Eucharist and baptism. On the other hand, she accepted much of the Catholic liturgy of the Catholic Church, and people who go to Episcopal services today, you will see that, these Catholic liturgy of Protestant teachings. She also accepted the structure of the Catholic Church, we talked last week, which included governance by bishops. So the Episcopal Church has bishops, the Methodist Church was derived by bishops. Presbyterian, that's what next slide. So during the reign of Bloody Mary, many Protestants had escaped to Geneva, where they learned a strict form of Calvinism. And they returned to England during the reign of Elizabeth, filled with admiration for thoroughgoing Protestantism. They found instead was sort of halfway between. And so they thought the church needed to be purified. So these so-called Puritans, which comes from the church purified, believed that the hierarchical structure of the Church of England, based on the Catholic Church, was inconsistent with Scripture. So they believed that a proper church is, quote, self-governing and chooses a pastor, a teacher, elders, deacons, and widows, in the New Testament designates, which of course the Presbyterian accepts. Let's go next slide. This is where this all begins to intersect with the history that we learn at school. A few of these Puritans became known as separatists. And I want you to keep these terms separate, because their intent of leaving the church in England entirely, which they concluded was beyond reform. So in 1592, separatist leaders, quote, were hanged for denying the Queen's supremacy in ecclesiastical matters. And in 1608, a group of separatists moved to Holland to worship independently of the Church of England. Y'all went to school.
Hey, Don.
Yes.
When you mentioned the Church of England, would that be considered
It's the Anglican
Catholic?
Church or the Episcopal Church today.
at that
Church.
time, so it was Episcopal,
It
not
became-
Catholic?
That's right. The
Right,
Church
okay.
of England separated from the Catholic Church. Pope became the king or the queen became the head of the church. We see it as the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church.
Okay, thank you.
Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So that's what the separatists are now. Their thing is beyond reform. They've been to Geneva. They've seen Calvinism in its strictest forms. They go back to England, think this can't possibly be saved. They begin getting hung, and then they move to Holland in 1608 to become independent of the Church of England, because Holland was not going to accept the Church of England's doctrine in Holland. One group then of these separatists, and this is where the story of the so-called Puritans in. One group of these separatists returned from Holland, and 100 of them sailed from Plymouth, England in 1620 aboard the Mayflower, settling ultimately what they called Plymouth, Massachusetts. This ship had a whole lot of different people on it, but there were some of these people, these so-called separatists. The separatist group we hear about celebrated the first Thanksgiving, but they're essentially unimportant to the rest of history. That group just came over, these separatist groups came over, had that little colony there in Plymouth, and eventually had no significance. We think a lot about them, but they had no effect. So let's go to the next slide. So this idea of separating from the Church of England was far too drastic for the majority of these Puritans. They wanted to still be part of the Church of England. They simply wanted to purify the church. So in 1630, a group of Puritans, intent on purifying the church but not leaving the Church of England, left on a 3-month trip to New England. These Puritans saw themselves as God's new Israel, chosen by God to purify Christianity in a new land. So John Winthrop, who you see here, wrote, quote, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, but we must remember that we shall be a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us." Reagan quoted that over the city on the hill. So these people were not the people that landed in Plymouth. These are a totally separate group of people. But they both get the term pilgrims because of Winthrop's description of these settlers. Both the separatists named based on Hebrews. Quote, "These descendants of Abraham all died in faith, not having received their promises, but having seen them from far off, and were persuaded of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims of." So these 700 non-separatist followers of Winthrop established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. totally separate organization from the Pilgrims. So during the next 10 years, I want you to sort of think about what this takes on ships. 20,000 non-separatist Puritans left England and settled in 10,000. They established congregations in Salem, Boston, Hartford, and New Haven. They were led by clergy ordained by the Church of England and considered themselves to be loyal to the church. They were the non-separatist Puritans. They were the Puritans. However, with the English authorities 3 months across the ocean, these New England Puritans were able to establish their goals to be purified, locally governed church sanctioned by law. As one author states, quote, they were able to do in New England what their fellow non-separatist Congregationalists longed to do in Old England. Set up their Congregationalist system under the law of the state as the sole established church. The United Church of Christ, if you look at its literature, traces its origins to these Puritan Congregationalists and credits them, quote, for giving birth to constitutional liberty in this country. But Jacques Barsoum, the great historian, calls this idea, quote, a national myth. These Puritans did not come to the New World, quote, for the sake of religious liberty, but for religious purity, to set up an ideal commonwealth according to God's laws as an example to inspire the whole world. Fail to attend church services, denial of Christ's resurrection, or baptism, irreverence of the Bible, could bring severe punishment. As one author writes, quote, Congregationalism was established by law, and the full meaning of non-separatist Congregationalism was vigorously insisted on religious uniformity and sought to restrain or exclude all dissidents became clear. So one of these dissidents was Mary Dyer, born in England, became a resident of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 1652, she and her husband returned to England, where they became followers of George Fox, quote, one of the few religious geniuses of English history. The followers of Fox rejected slavery, war, professional ministries, external sacraments, and titles of authority. They were given the name Quakers because Fox told the magistrate at his blasphemy trial that he should, quote, tremble at the word of God. Mary Dyer returned to Massachusetts, espousing these Quaker beliefs of pacifism and modesty, and she was hanged for her beliefs on the Boston Common Court of the Massachusetts General Court, the body responsible for enforcing the civil law in accordance with the teachings of the local church. 3 Quaker men were also hanged before King Charles II of England found out about this and ordered the end of executions. Next slide. Anne Hutchinson was a member of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. At the time, many of the churches in New England had adopted what is called covenant or federal theology. They taught that believers who experienced conversion made a covenant with God, in which they promised to obey God in return for God's promise to save them. Covenant idea. Anne Hutchinson flatly rejected this idea, which she said was inconsistent with the teachings of Luther and Calvin. The salvation comes entirely from God's grace and not from a promise. She said, quote, grace follows no rules, she said. It may come to the town drunk or a prostitute as likely as to the most respectable citizen. For her beliefs, which were consistent with Calvinism, a synod of ministers convicted her of heresy and banished her to Rhode Island, where she and her 15 children were massacred by the Indians in 1640. As I said earlier, trying to control people's belief, people die. The colony of Rhode Island had been established by Roger Williams, a priest who came to New England in 1630 seeking religious freedom, but soon learned that, quote, the Puritan Congregationalists did not allow freedom of worship. He bought some land and founded the city of Providence in 1636, quote, as a haven for free spirits. Williams believed the people who did not believe the way he believed would go to hell, but it's not his responsibility to make matters for them worse in this life. So even Rhode Island under Roger Williams was not open to everyone, quote, it guaranteed freedom of belief to all but outspoken atheists, and for some decades, the Roman Catholics. So the tolerance of Rhode Island was unusual among the colonies. Following the pattern that existed in England, following the Peace of Westphalia in 1548, most colonies established a specific religion and expected their residents to follow that religion at least in part. New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia required their citizens to support the Church of England. Maryland did not have an established church named after Mary of England, but quote, provided for the execution or forfeiture of all lands of any resident who blasphemed or denied the doctrines of the Trinity and the divinity of Christ. Pennsylvania, founded in 1682 by Quaker William Penn, did not have an established church and tolerate virtually all beliefs. Penn invited sects being persecuted in England to come to Pennsylvania. Among the ones who came are the Mennonites from Germany, the survivors of the Anabaptist movement who arrived in 1683. That's why we have so many Germans arriving in Pennsylvania. They were ancestors. Yes.
Maryland was Catholic, right?
Sorry?
Maryland was Catholic.
Maryland was Catholic.
Okay.
Yes. After Queen Mary. Yeah. Next one. So by the late 1600s, despite the examples of Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, there was little religious freedom in the colonies, particularly in New England. As in Europe, governments controlled belief and punished heresies. In 1692, 19 people and one dog were hanged as witches in Salem, Massachusetts, upon the order of the local government.
What did the dog do?
1692. The dog was occupied by a ghost.
And that's how they killed him, was hanging.
Oh, hanging. Is he hanging up there?
Yeah, not there.
No, the dog was hung.
Wait, where was the dog that was, I didn't see that.
He just
He
said,
said- he said that one
He was
dog,
possessed.
19 people.
Oh, okay, I was looking at the pictures.
no,
In Salem.
he was possessed.
Possessed. I want you to keep in mind, this is 1692. Okay, I'm sorry. Unknown to many Americans, religious freedom in the United States can be traced to the writings of two 17th century English, Isaac Newton and John Locke, who have been called, quote, the kindred spirits in the dangerous area of anti-Trinitarianism. Newton, who became a fellow of Trinity College in Cambridge in 1667, was a serious biblical scholar, quote, who wrote as much about the book of Revelation as about the theory of gravity. Quote, he believed in the God of nature, a God of the whole universe, and he could not believe that the truth about God had been revealed only through Christ. In 1687, Newton published his famous Principia, which explained that the motions of the planets could be defined by a mathematical formula. Quote, Europe was captivated by the wonder of Newton's world machine. The medieval world of unseen spirits, angels, and demons could now be dismissed as superstition. In its place moved a universe subject to physical laws expressed in mathematical symbols. Based on Newton's laws of motion, it was now possible to imagine the universe as a giant clock with each action dependent on prior actions. As one author says, quote, to thinking persons, the physical universe no longer appeared as the field of arbitrary divine action, but as an interpretable realm of law. And some people conclude that Newton's clockwork universe had, quote, reduced God to an unnecessary hypothesis. Others, called deists, thought, quote, just as a ticking watch presupposes a watchmaker, so deists thought that the rational mechanistic harmony of nature revealed a deity. Deists rejected the divinity, incarnation, and atonement of Jesus. Quote, deism throve in the 18th century in Europe, partly because the mechanical universe could dispense with the clockmaker after it given its initial wind up. That's the deist view. Let's go next slide. But Jonathan Edwards, who has been described as America's greatest theological genius, reached a much different conclusion than deists from the writings of Newton. Those views contributed to the development of religious freedom. Edwards argued that Newton had demonstrated that the Calvinist belief in predestination was correct. Quote, Newton's philosophy implies that the universe is a system in which everything follows necessarily from prior causes. Therefore, the choices of people who live in the universe, as described by Newton, must be predetermined from the beginning of time. So Edwards was then one of the leaders of what is called the Great Awakening, which swept the colonies just before the American Revolution. By this time, religious fervor of the original settlers had diminished. In this environment of spiritual malaise, Edwards and others held outdoor revival meetings, independently of the churches, preaching the divine light that enter people and save them from sin, imparting immediately toward a conviction of the truth which is revealed in the Word of God. George Whitefield from England was the most active of the Great Awakening preachers, speaking to crowds of up to 8,000 people at a time, from Georgia to Maine. Using startling images, he could make his listeners feel the pain of sin and the terror of hell. This preaching led to faintings and outcries and conversions of people who did not belong to any church. Quote, the Great Awakening led people from theories about religion to the experience of it. A new type of piety developed alongside the rationalism of the Enlightenment, which is often called the religion of the heart. The Great Awakening, quote, provoked a split in American churches between those who saw it as the work of God and those who condemned it as enthusiastic nonsense. In 1745, the Presbyterian Church split into two synods, one called the Old Side and the other the New Side, consisting of those people who've been converted by Edwards and Whitefield. So we have the establishment churches, we have the people out here listed, preachers are saying religion is within you, it's not in the church.
We may have an ancestor of Whitfield in the room tonight.
We do.
We may.
No, really?
I believe it's
Whitfield
a
uprising.
descendant, not a there.
No, we're gonna see how that led to religious freedom.
Yeah, I may or may not want to claim that.
So Benjamin Franklin was a deist who believed in God but had, quote, some doubts about the divinity of Jesus. While Franklin stayed away from the churches, he made donations to them. They might help some people love their neighbors. Imagine that. Like most deists, Franklin, quote, believed that all religions were basically the same and came to believe that religious toleration was vital to a free society. As a deist, Franklin rejected much of the message of the Great Awakening. But he nonetheless thought it was a good idea because it was putting power in the hands of the people and taking away from the established churches, most of them still loyal to England. So in 1740, when the established churches in Philadelphia closed their doors on Whitefield, your ancestor, Benjamin Franklin arranged for the construction of a great hall where ministers of all denominations could preach. In Franklin, the twin legacies of Newton, deism on the one hand, and the evangelical fervor ignited by Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield on the other, came together and formed a revolutionary political agenda. Religion was beginning to be seen as a matter of individual conscience, not to be controlled by anyone but the believer. With the awakening, with its emphasis on personal salvation, individual authority, and voluntary association, nurtured nascent democratic values of equality and freedom of conscience. As one author notes, quote, it is no exaggeration to say that the roots of the American Revolution and the growing religious alienation between the new popular American religion and the established religion of England.
So it's interesting because you said personal salvation, and then it came from that awakening.
Awakening.
So it didn't really come around until, what did you say, 1700?
1700s, right, just before the revolution. This idea that that religion comes to you, not
As a
from the
person.
church, gave rise to this idea that the people should be free. It's religious.
But also gave birth to the American thought that it's all about me.
That's
That's what I was,
So John Locke was an English philosopher and physician. In 1689, 3 years before the hanging of the witches in Salem, Locke wrote a letter on religious toleration that was soon printed and made its way across the Atlantic. The views of this extraordinary letter are as relevant today as they were more than 326 years ago. Cool, let's go next slide. Locke started his letter by saying he believed toleration to be the chief characteristic mark of the true church. As he wrote, the toleration of those that differ from others in matters of religion is so agreeable to the gospel of Jesus Christ and to the genuine reason of mankind that it seems monstrous for men to be so blind as not to perceive the necessity and advantages of it in so clear a light. For Locke, go back to Jennifer, the only religious belief that mattered to a person's salvation was that what came from within. Such a belief could not be compelled. He said, quote, "It is only light and evidence against the work of change in man's opinion, which like in no manner proceed from corporal sufferings or in any other outward penitence. Therefore, quote, all the power of civil government relates only to men's civil interest, is confined to the care of things of this world, and have nothing to do with the world to come." According to Locke, if governments could legitimately compel religious beliefs, government with non-Christian majorities compel their citizens to reject Christianity. As he wrote rhetorically, quote, "And what if in another country, the Mohammedan or a pagan prince, the Christian religion seemed false and offensive to God? May not the Christians for the same reason, after the same manner, be extirpated there?" Let's go to the next slide. So for Locke, since the church and secular authorities operate in different realms, neither can impose its will on the other. And as a result, he said, whatsoever is lawful in the Commonwealth cannot be prohibited by the magistrate in the church. This principle is a necessary corollary that we'll talk a lot about next week. But it's the heart of today's debates about religious freedom. Quote, "Those things that are prejudicial to the commonweal of a people in their ordinary use and are therefore forbidden by laws, those things ought not to be permitted to churches in their sacred rites." As Locke wrote, if some congregation should have a mind to sacrifice infants, is the magistrate obliged to tolerate them because they are committed in a religious assembly? I answer no. These things are not lawful in the ordinary course of life, nor in any private house, and therefore neither are they so in the worship of God or in any religious meeting. Locke also argued that even long-standing religious practices could be banned if demanded by the needs of society, such as the banning the ritual sacrificing of cattle, quote, in order to the increasing of the stock of cattle that have been destroyed by some extraordinary murrain. In other words, Locke argued that the most basic religious practices can be banned if inconsistent with compelling government purpose. As we will see next week, that argument is the heart of debates about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. When can the interests of society overcome even the most sincerely held religious beliefs? Next slide. So finally, Locke argued that governments could not impose religious qualifications on people seeking its benefits. As he said, if we may openly speak the truth, and as becomes one man to another, neither pagan, nor Mohammedan, nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion. But for Locke, atheists should not have civil rights because, quote, promises, covenants, and oath, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist.
Wow, so much for tolerance.
Excellent.
Always a line.
Almost made it.
Almost. So Locke's letter had an enormous influence on our founding father. John Adams, who studied the writings of Locke at Harvard, came to believe that Christian leaders quote, preferred to rule through intimidation rather than persuasion. So, Thomas Jefferson had a copy of Locke's letter in his library. His notes on the letter include the following summary of Locke's views. For whatsoever is lawful in the Commonwealth or permitted to the subject in the ordinary way cannot be forbidden to him for religious uses. And whatsoever is prejudicial to the Commonwealth and their ordinary uses and therefore prohibited by law ought not to be permitted to churches and their sacred rites. Using Locke's example, Jefferson noted that the religious freedom would not allow child sacrifice because, quote, it is unlawful in the ordinary course of things or in a private house to murder a child. Like Newton and Franklin, Jefferson was a deist who believed that Jesus was extraordinary but not holy. Jefferson, as I think you know, produced a special edition of the New Testament which included Jesus' teachings but left out all the miracles. In his letter to John Adams, Jefferson proposed that the true religion was the sublime doctrines of philanthropism and deism taught us by Jesus of Nazareth, in which we all agree. I think this is a great sentence. One author says, quote, Jefferson was anti-Christian and pro-Jesus, anti-religion and pro-God. The Declaration of Independence, which was largely written by Jefferson, mentions divine in terms compatible with many of the world's religions. Let's go next one. The Declaration of Independence uses nature. Nature is God, creator, supreme judge, divine providence when referring to a higher power. The Declaration of Independence has no language suggesting nuclear Christian beliefs, and even omits the phrase in the year of our Lord from its date. As one author knows, quote, the nature God of Jefferson's Declaration that's not a Calvinist God, but a deist God of natural religion discovered through reason. Jefferson later characterized the Declaration of Independence as establishing both the free right of the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. In 1779, 3 years after the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, as a member of the Virginia General Assembly, introduced what became known as a statute for religious freedom. He supported the bill with arguments drawn from Locke's letter. Paraphrasing that letter, Jefferson argued that, quote, the opinions of man are not the object of civil government, nor under its jurisdiction. And like Locke, he argued that acts based on religious beliefs could be outlawed when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. Because Jefferson had been sent to France by the Confederation Congress in 1784, James Madison pushed Jefferson's statute for religious freedom through the Virginia legislature. When finally enacted in 1786, and this is before the First Amendment, the statute guaranteed no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, that all men should be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. As Jefferson later wrote, because a great majority of the legislatures had rejected a provision limiting religious freedom to Christians, the statute, quote, comprehended within the mantle of its protections the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel in every denomination. As a result of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, for the first time in American history, individuals anywhere in the world were guaranteed the right to believe as they chose without fear of punishment from the government. Virginia statute was one of the three accomplishments Jefferson mandated for his epitaph, along with the founding of the University of Virginia and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. You can see the President of the United States is not on his epitaph. As a young man, James Madison took from his studies of Locke not only a passion for religious tolerance, but also the epistemological point that the very makeup of man pretty much guarantees a diversity of viewpoints and perspectives. From the time he was 22, Madison came down firmly on the side of religious freedom, arguing that the liberty of conscience could guarantee civil and political liberty. With Jefferson in Paris, Madison became quote, the nation's most zealous champion of religious freedom. In his work in developing the basic structure of the United States Constitution, Madison's quote, goal is a godless government sufficiently protected from religious to ensure individual liberty. Those are important words to remember. Next slide. United States Constitution was submitted to the states in 1787. Unlike every prior document in the world establishing a government, it made no reference to God or any higher power. As one of those written, quote, in the light of the unbroken record of invoking God's name in foundational documents throughout the world, throughout the colonies, and throughout history, the stubborn refusal of the U.S. Constitution to invoke the Almighty is abnormal, historic, radical, and not accidental. Government power did not come from God, but from the people. As one of the writes, the lack of a reference to God or religious purpose in the Constitution should not be surprising, considering the religious beliefs of the men involved in the oppression of the task at hand. And because the power came from the people and not from God, the Constitution expressly states, quote, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. This provision would highlight the secular nature of the Constitution and the new government's non-reliance on religious principles. During the ratification debates, opponents of this provision expressed objections that seem all too consistent with current views. One person feared that, quote, pagans, deists, and Mohammedans might obtain offices among us. Another worried if the president were Jewish, quote, our dear posterity may be ordered to rebuild Jerusalem. The Constitution's ban on religious tests for government office applied only to federal officers. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, all but 2 states, Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, had religious tests banning Jews, Unitarians, and agnostics from public office. Madison feared the states would continue to impose their religious views on their citizens and tried to give Congress the power to veto state laws impeding on the rights of religious and religious minorities. Everett failed in part because Southern lawmakers saw immediately that this could lead to Congress outlawing slavery. From Europe, Thomas Jefferson told Madison the Constitution was defective because it lacked a Bill of Rights giving citizens rights against the government. Jefferson wanted the Constitution to provide, among other things, freedom of religion and freedom of the press. In a letter to Madison sent from Paris on July 31st, 1788, Jefferson made clear that neither of these rights could be absolute. Quote, a declaration that the federal government will never restrain the presses from printing anything they please will not take away the liability of the printers for false facts printed. In repeating arguments that originated with Locke, Jefferson said, quote, the declaration that religious faith shall be unpunished does not give immunity to criminal acts dictated by religious error. Jefferson did not specify what he meant by religious error, but he previously noted, as had Locke, that the government had the power to stop child sacrifice. On June the 8th, 1789, Madison introduced in the House of Representatives 7 amendments to the Constitution that eventually became known as our Bill of Rights. At that time, North Carolina and Rhode Island were still not a part of the Union and refused to ratify the Constitution unless it included 12 amendments proposed by Madison that would limit the power of the federal government. In addition, Madison had proposed an amendment of his own that no one else had suggested. Quote, no state shall violate the equal rights of conscience or the freedom of the press or trial by jury in criminal cases. Quote, this was Madison's final attempt to write the federal veto of state laws into the Constitution and underscored his view that the principal threat to individual rights came from the unjust majority factions in the states operating against the majority. Madison's effort to impose limits on state governments failed. September the 25th, 1789, 12 amendments to the Constitution were approved by Congress and submitted to the states for ratification. On December the 15th, 1791, 10 of those amendments had been ratified by the states and became part of the Constitution. The First Amendment states, as I think you know, the Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peacefully assembled, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The language of the First Amendment resulted from compromises between Madison, who favored a complete separation between religion and the government, and Christian evangelicals who wanted to eliminate only government supported churches. As a result, the precise meaning of this language has been disputed ever since and to this minute. As one of them says, quote, the First Amendment resolved nothing. It fell short of clarifying the proper relationship of the state. It could plausibly be read as an expression of all positions at once. So until the 20th century, recently, the First Amendment had no application to the states. However, with the inspiration of the federal constitution, the states began eliminating religious requirements and privileges from their laws, the last of those being eliminated in Massachusetts in 1833. The states also began adopting their own bills of rights modeled on the federal example. The Indiana Constitution, enacted and adopted in 1851, contains a Bill of Rights with several provisions seeking to secure religious freedom. Section 5 of the Indian Constitution states, quote, no religious test shall be required as a qualification for any office or trust or profit. Article 1, Section 3 provides, no law shall in any case whatever control the free exercise and enjoyment of religious opinions or interfere with the rights of conscience. Notice what is prohibited. The control of opinions. How this relates to acts undertaken in accordance with opinions is at the heart of current debates. And what if the acts undertaken in support of religious beliefs violate laws applicable to everyone, such as laws prohibiting child sacrifice or animal cruelty? So next week, we will look at the development of religious freedom in the United States since the enactment of the First Amendment. As we will see, as we now understand it, what would take another century to achieve. Recognizing the vision of the founding fathers has not been easy or consistent, especially in light of 19th century efforts to enshrine Orthodox Christianity as the only true religion.
What do you mean by,
Yes,
sorry, what do you mean by Orthodox Christianity? Do you mean evangelism or?
yes.
Okay.
We'll see that next week. There were efforts to say Christianity is practiced by the evangelicals is the basis of the country's freedoms.
Okay.
And you'll see that to this day. People are trying to do that to this day. Nor has it been easy to determine what laws generally applicable to everyone can be avoided by people claiming to have a religious objection to it. It was in this environment that the so-called Religious Freedom Restoration Acts were enacted, which we will talk about. And we will see that reconciling religious beliefs with other values is not easy. So I'm going to tell you what we're going to do next week. We're going to have a relatively shorter presentation. I'm going to hand you out then 10 questions. How you would balance religious freedom with other values. And we'll do this, I've done this before, we'll do this without talking about it. We'll just individually do this. And then we'll see how consistent or inconsistent our views really are. So let me give you the example that sort of begins this test. We have this statement going all the way back to law. We'll talk about this next week. It goes all the way back to law. But the general law prohibits that religious beliefs cannot make it, cannot make it legal, right? Case against the Supreme Court is a case involving Native Americans smoking peyote in their religious ceremonies, a hallucinogenic drug. The Supreme Court said that since that law is generally applicable, well, then they can't do it. You have similar laws saying if it's illegal for minors to drink wine, they can't take communion. How those get resolved is very interesting.
The cannabis church of.
Cannabis church started on that premise. So
Right.
in any event, we'll have some fun with this. So I think you'll find that it's harder than you thought. And it's based on biases perhaps you didn't know you had.
Can I back up to
Yeah,
earlier?
sure.
First of all, this could be a whole slideshow of hairstyles that are just awesome. I think we could put all the slides together. With like no women represented, still amazing. Oh,
Locks.
no,
Oh, no, that was new.
Sir,
Oh, that's
Newton,
Newton.
Newton. But I was fascinated by the idea that these separatists come over and they start hanging people, which, you know, just keeps happening. But that the king is the one who stops them, that they like listen to the king. I mean, there's just such a complexity of the, like, when are we're done
Well,
with
remember,
you, king,
these people are loyal to the Church of England. The king is the head of the Church of England, right?
Right, so
So
even
if-
though we've left and we're.
Even though we've left, we still think we're in some sense substance. When the king says, stop killing people, right?
Yeah.
That's our leader. That's now our leader. The Pope is no longer a leader. The King of England is our leader. So when the king says, stop hanging these people, they stop hanging these people.
And when did Catholics start coming to the US more? Was it a more
Well, they came to
twentieth
Maryland.
century
They were
immigration?
Maryland. Remember Mary,
Yeah,
Bloody Mary was the Queen of England.
okay.
Catholic Queen of England. They named it after her. They started coming to England during her reign, named Maryland in honor. Virginia, by the way, is named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. So they're named after the Queen Elizabeth. So she was a Protestant queen. Mary was the Roman Catholic. Good question. Other questions? Comments, thoughts?
I taught kindergarten and so I'd have to go back, you know, like to the Pilgrims.
Change the whole thing.
Change the whole thing.
People, you think about people who are so proud of their lineage to the Mayflower,
Right.
and your point is like, came, went, like that's the thing, and then other
Well,
people.
remember, the United Church of Christ says we got our religious freedoms from these Puritans.
Right,
And Jacques Bourzoon said that's a false. They didn't come for religious freedom. They came to hang the people that didn't agree with them. They came to keep from being hanged by the king, but they came to hang the people that didn't agree with them. So religious freedom was their freedom to hang people as opposed to being hung.
so it wasn't until.
Well, that's so much later.
That's the quote of the night, right there.
How long did the idea of religious purity last?
So last today.
Well, yeah,
Still,
it seemed to me like it got fractured almost as soon as I don't like you, you don't like me.
well, sure, but the heresy, you don't get each other heresies. That's the other guys. That's what the heresy is. But I think everybody today is trying to purify the church, right? They're all saying you have to be pure, you have to follow the rules that I say. We wouldn't have so many denominations if we didn't have that view, right? Which is you have to do what I say is the truth, not what somebody else says is the truth. These are
Well, and people accuse liberals now, I mean, of us of trying to purify, that we're trying to make everybody into,
the liberal.
you know, we're liberal, wow.
So the good news is we mostly stopped killing people. For their beliefs.
Well, we in the United
The
States.
United States, yes, the United States. We've not stopped killing people in Myanmar, places like that. China, yes, true. Other thoughts, questions? By the way, I hope this gives a whole different spin on American history. I think it does. And by the way, if your ancestor was George Whitefield, you can credit him with the idea that people have a right to their own views.
I mean, so far I feel proud to claim him.
Now, he was out there with this, this emotional idea, right? This emotional idea, which is by God, you can be saved in this instant. We see that today in evangelism, right? And it's not you have to go do the church and do what the church says. You have to do what God tells you. And that's a liberating thing. that Franklin then picked up on and said, I can use this idea of individual freedom against England. I can get the people now riled up against England on this idea that they should be free. And it came from guys like Whitfield, John Nichols. Really did.
I think it's very interesting because what I see happen is that then a lot of those more conservative Puritan-like views were transferred through missionary work to
Mhm.
They
Africa
were.
and is igniting a lot of the non-religious freedom issues.
Uh-huh.
Yes,
That they're suffering.
I think that's a wonderful
And so
observation.
I just think it's like, interesting, in a bad way. So,
Just keep in mind, you hear the word Puritan. They're trying to purify this, take out all the stuff that came from the Church of England, all the circumstance, all of the stuff from the Catholic ritual. They wanted to eliminate all of that. And you've heard the story that the Puritan just wakes up in the middle of the night worrying that somebody else having a good time. Somewhere in the world, somebody's having fun. They're very austere, very austere. And again, they were hanging people. They were hanging Mary Dyer because she was a Quaker in favor of peace.
Heaven forbid.
Heaven forbid. Other comments?
I also like the, just the different thoughts about how everything has progressed over time and, you know, so while we quote may have religious freedom, if you watch any campaign commercial, you're gonna see people talk about like, I'm a conservative Christian going for this office, whatever. So it's interesting that we have freedom of religion, but, doesn't always play. Yeah.
But it's also so interesting to me that that is such an Indiana thing, and that does not play at all in California.
Right.
You know, even within our own country, you go to New York or something, they like would get hives over what our gubernatorial, you know, that state by state thing is fascinating, especially as we're talking about things like abortion law and stuff that's so interwoven with religion now that we've taken this.
We'll talk next week about a recent decision of the Indiana Court of Appeals in abortion and religious freedom. It's an interesting case. We'll talk more about it. So how that will come.
Are you gonna talk any about Christian nationalism, what Christian nationalism next week? Will that enter into any of it?
Well,
Looks at the clock. How much
I'm
time?
gonna give you a 5 minutes on this, right? 5 minutes. And then we talk as much about it as we can. I think it was either Gallup or Pew recently did a survey, a 50-state survey, in which they asked people a series of questions, including, can the United States really be a country if Christianity doesn't dominate its view? Should laws based on Christianity be law just because of questions like that? Based on the answers to those questions, they then ranked people as on a scale from not a Christian nationalist to a full-fledged Christian nationalist, when you mean that they want Christians to be in charge of the government, right?
Right.
They then, there's a map that then, state by state, how many people in that state rank as either right up there at the top of Christian nationalism or just below it, right? Mississippi leads the list, 50%. What do you think Indiana's percentage? You want to guess?
49.
40, well, no, it's 40, it's 40. 40% of Hoosiers meet the test of Christian nationalists, meaning the Christians should be in charge of the government and no one else should be involved. Despite this.
And I would argue that this presentation, if you could come into this with an open mind, which challenge one, but should help you understand why that's a bad thing.
It should not be so expensive. People, as I
Because
say,
you're seeing it repeated over.
you
and
want to,
over
if you
and over
control
again.
somebody else's religious beliefs, people die. People die. And you may be one of the ones that die, or you may be one of the ones that kill, but somebody's gonna die. And so, yeah, we see that. We've seen, by the way, we haven't got to the end of this yet.
Yeah.
We haven't got to the end. We're three presentations into 4. We're at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and we still haven't seen the end of people dying.
Well, and I think today they've died too, like, I mean, there's been people that have been harassed or killed because of their sexuality or whatever, and it's not okay under the law, but it's still happening.
It's not sanctioned state killing.
Right, but it's still happening because of beliefs.
So,
Yeah.
try to control people's belief, people die. Other thoughts? Karen? Brian, any other thoughts? I hate to.
I don't know,
Leave people such a down mood. By the way, I think next week we'll sort of begin to turn this around a little bit. We'll begin to get in the 20th century and see what sort of happened in the 20th century.
Yeah, to riff a little off of what Jennifer was saying too, another thing that really struck me, was all that language around there's no religious litmus test for holding office. And wasn't Kennedy the first Catholic?
Yes.
And that was shocking that a
Shocking, right.
Catholic actually, you
First
know, and so
elect,
to kind of, what's that?
first elected, Dewey ran.
Yes, yeah.
Well,
but
I
just-
think going back to this comment about all these people running as a conservative candidate for governor, if you don't say that, in the end, you may not be able to win.
Yeah.
And you still, most still put their hand on the Bible, right? To declare allegiance, not everyone, but most,
Mhm,
to take their oath of office.
mhm.
So, yeah, we got a lot, but by the way, as we will see next week, beginning in the 1920s, this began to move in different directions. Here's where we are.
Mhm.
Very good.
Okay.
Mm.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.